Welcome back, Curious Hearts. I'm Vera. Together, in every episode, we get to explore what it is we really believe, how we practice, and we get to meet people who are on their own spiritual path. Together, we begin. Today's episode is not just maybe one of my favorite subjects, my favorite episodes that I will ever record. I could talk about it for hours. But it is also probably the most important. And if you only ever listen to one episode, if you only ever read one thing that I write, I hope that it is about this subject today, which is change. All of our spiritual practices, in my belief, all of the principles lead us back to this, which is that whether you like it or you don't like it, it will change. Whether you're in a relationship that is extraordinary and magical and enchanting, it will change. And someday you will find yourself either bored or distracted or questioning. You will look at that person that you once hung on every word and you'll be like, when will you shut up? Maybe you find yourself completely in the middle of your life at a moment where you're like, what is this all for? You feel devastated. You feel like nothing you've done has been worth it. Like many of us, you get to your midlife and you're like, I have worked so hard for everything that I've done so far. And why am I doing this? What is it all for? And then without realizing it, without even intending, something appears. Maybe it's a hobby or a relationship or a work experience. Maybe you just have a chance meeting with someone who completely changes your whole perspective. And suddenly you can see the landscape of your life in a completely different way. Sometimes these changes are mundane, right? There's construction on your way to work, and so you have to go a different way. Inevitably, we get to the end of a project and it is complete. We have to move on to something else. Almost all of us in the course of our professional lives will find ourselves coming to the end of a road and realizing that it's time to move on to a new position. Sometimes that's just, sort of a mundane shift. And for some of us, it's quite intense and transformative. For me, I've had an experience of both. Sometimes leaving one job, looking for the next because I was ready to grow more. Sometimes, as when I left my fundraising roles, I couldn't do it anymore. It felt devastating and extraordinary. And in that moment, it felt like it would never change. I was trying so hard to make something else happen. I wanted to change myself. I wanted to be able to fit myself to meet the situation around me so that I wouldn't have to blow up my life. And I couldn't. And if I knew then what I know now, I would have made that leap so much sooner. Because the truth, which I say over and over to my students and to remind myself, whether you like something or you don't like something, it will change. And so many of the stories that come from spiritual traditions are about this. So many of the practices that we do are about learning to meet every moment as a new moment rather than needing something to stay exactly the way that it was before. There's a story that I love from the yoga tradition, and it comes from a place in the south of India called Chidambaram, where there is a temple to Nataraj. And if you are a yoga asana practitioner, you probably are familiar with Natarajasana, that posture. The balancing pose, it's a back bend. It's translated sometimes as king dancer pose. And you reach back with one arm and bend your knee and catch your foot with that same hand. So it is a balancing posture and a back bend and a thigh stretch. And it's sort of the multitasker of postures. The story behind Natarajasana, the story of Nataraj, comes from Chidambaram, and it goes a little bit like this. Deep in the south of India, in a dense forest, a forest where the trees are so close that unless it is close to noontime, the shadows fall heavy. And because it's so dark in the forest, the folks who live there must build fires. They build hearth fires where the wives and mothers and caretakers of the home, where they heat water for baths, where they cook meals. There's heat in the house to keep things warm in the winter. But also, the men of the forest, because this is the truth of the story, that the men are the yoga practitioners and their spouses, their wives, are at home caring for their families. The men of the sages of this forest, they go to their practice every day, and their practice also revolves around a fire. And around that fire, they practice mantra, and they practice ritual, and they offer things to the fire. And this is a practice that is sacred and that is passed down from generation of sage to generation. It is a deep commitment. So these sages, initially, like the eldest generations, they did this practice with humility in their hearts, and they did it in a spirit of devotion because they are all devoted to Shiva. And Shiva is the god of change. In the Indian pantheon, at the end of every age of the universe, it is Shiva's responsibility to completely destroy the universe in order for a new one to be reborn. It's a pretty heavy job. It's an important one. It's really essential. But the ages of the world are quite long, and so he has a lot of free time in the meanwhile. So sometimes what he has a tendency of doing is noticing when his devotees get off track, or when they are distracted, or when they become confused. So that is what happened to the pine forest sages. The pine forest sages found themselves getting a little haughty and a little proud of themselves. They found that they had, from their practices, from throwings into the fire, practicing their mantra and their meditation, and all of the shifting of energy, that things would begin to emerge from the fire. They began to get very impressed with themselves. They began to brag and to compete. And it was in this moment that Shiva decided he would pay them a visit. So he asked Vishnu, his friend, his cohort, to come with them. And they arrived on the earth embodied as people, very humbly. He became what they call a wandering mendicant. He is a wandering prayer monk who travels from village to village purely on subsistence, offering modest teachings in exchange for sustenance. And his name is Bhikshatana. So Bhikshatana arrives on the earth, and he finds his way into the village first. And he meets all of the wives and all of the children. And he begins to tell them extraordinary stories of the beginning and the end of the universe. He begins to tell them magical tall tales, and they are enraptured. They are magnetized to his every word. At the same time, Vishnu takes the embodiment of a woman, and that woman's name is Mohini, which means desire. She is the potency of our attraction. So Mohini, with her swaying hips and her beautiful hair and her subtle aroma, arrives into the mix of the pine forest sages. And they begin to see her as she walks around the fire, around the homa, and she begins to introduce herself to each of the sages. And the sages begin to find that they want to compete with her. They want to prove themselves. Each of them is trying to capture her attention. And so they are throwing more herbs into the fire And they are casting more mantras and more chants that have become spells as a way of one-upping each other. And they become so jealous and so haughty and so competitive, trying to gain her attention, that they don't realize what's happened, and suddenly she's gone. And they're all sort of heartbroken that she's left, and they surrender their day, and they begin to leave the fire and make their way home. And all the while, they are arguing with each other about whose fault it is that Mohini left. And if you had only just, or why did you do that? When they arrive back in the village, what do they find? They find their wives and their children abandoning everything that they, quote unquote, should have been doing, enraptured in the stories of this monk. And their wives have a certain glimmer, a glint in their eye. And the sages become jealous, and they become enraged. And they challenge this mendicant. They challenge Bhikshatana. They say, who do you think you are? What is it that you think you're doing? How dare you come into our village without our permission? You're a foreigner. You don't belong here. This belongs to us. And Bhikshatana is charming and sort of aloof in the way that Shiva can be. And he says, well, how would you challenge me? And they say, we are great monks. We have extraordinary yogic powers. We will show you what true yoga can be. And Bhikshatana agrees. And so the monks begin to repeat their mantras, and they begin to offer their practices. And then they begin to cast their magic. And out of the fire, first, crawls a giant tiger, a tiger greater and taller than any tiger you have ever seen, whose shoulders stands at the head of Bhikshatana. And he is a towering figure that this single man should be terrified of. And instead of any other fear, instead of anything else, Bhikshatana, this half-naked monk, begins to dance. He begins to beat a double-headed drum to create a rhythm. And he begins to turn and swirl, almost like a whirling dervish. And as he does this, his dreadlocks spread wide out into the earth. And the sages are clearly profoundly confused about what he's doing. But before they knew it, before they realized it, suddenly the tiger, he sits back on his haunches and goes to leap. And as he leaps to pounce on this dancing whatever he is, Shiva reaches up a single finger, and with the tip of his nail, he skins the tiger from the chin all the way through the belly to the tail. And before they realize it, Shiva has wrapped the skin of the tiger around his shoulders without losing a beat. The sages realize at this moment that they are dealing with a yogi who knows what he's talking about, but they are not yet ready to give up. So they debate amongst themselves, and then one of them says, we will call the serpent. The serpent is the greatest, most fierce. And the serpent comes out of the fire, and it is the greatest king cobra you can imagine. And he rears up his head, and he spreads his great hood, and the hood is wider than a man's arm's width. And Bhikshatana, Shiva, dancing without skipping a beat. One of his arms reaches out of the swirl, grabs the head of the snake, and he wraps him around his waist and ties him like a belt. At this point, it is clear to the sages that they must call their most fierce, their most intense weapon. This is a thing that they have only reckoned with a few times. And they begin to pray and chant their mantras, and they offer the most rare herbs into the fire. And it requires all of them at once, repeating exactly the perfect mantra in exactly the perfect way. And out of the fire comes a little gnome. This little gnome, this little physical demon creature, has long teeth and nails, and he has saliva that drips from his mouth because he can't quite close his lips. And each of the drips of his saliva, when they drop to the earth, they burn like acid. And he snorts while he walks, and he comes with his fierce claws. And he is the demon of ignorance. He is the demon of our forgetfulness of reality. He is the representation of the illusion we are all trapped in. And so, what does Nataraj do? Well, of course, he begins to dance. He continues his swirling and his magic. And before they know it, Nataraj is dancing right on that demon's head. And in that moment, the spell of their haughtiness, of their arrogance is broken. And the pine forest sages, these monks, they fall to their knees and they plead for forgiveness because they realize that they not only have been beat, but that they are far from being evenly matched. And then finally in that moment, Shiva reveals his true nature and he begins to take what we call the Ananda Tandava. This is the dance of bliss. And the temple in Chidambaram has it has 108 snapshots of that Ananda Tandava. And each of those snapshots is itself an extraordinary piece of art. One of the 108 looks like the Natarajasana that you may have practiced. And as they resolve the lesson, Shiva allows the sages to continue about their business. And yet for them, everything has changed because now they have an understanding of humility. They have seen the awesome reality of Shiva, and all of these things that they had become distracted by, they are no longer distracted, and they instead return to their original and true purpose of finding that deep spiritual connection. I have spent so many hours, days with this mantra or with this story. I love it. It is part of the bhakti tradition for me. And traditionally is to learn the stories, to tell the stories. And they say when you find a murti, and the murtis are statues that are imbued with the living being of the deity, that when you meet that murti, you'll feel that attraction, that like mohini drive, like it's like looking in a crowd and like your true love turns and sees you. And I don't know that I ever actually believed that would happen until one day I was at a festival and there was a table of these murtis and maybe 40 or 50 of them. And sort of tucked in the third row behind some others was this murti. This is the murti that is called the Moksha Shiva. And this is the final image in the Ananda Tandava. You can see that Shiva has just one hand touching this illusion, our abhishesha, our confusion about what is real and unreal. And he is moving upwards. It's just before he releases himself back to heaven, back to the heavenly realms. So I have this on my altar. This is a reminder of the paradox of what we're doing here, which is it is only because we are so attached to the illusion that we are real, that like Vera is real, that this body is Vera, that that makes me separate and different from everybody else. Only because of that can I be in the dance. Can I be in this like changing, whirling, constantly moving reality? And in the moment that we are released from that illusion, this is moksha, right? That is a different lecture for a different day to sort of explain all of the core teachings of sort of this Hindu approach. But I love this story not because I want to, but instead because the story of my spiritual evolution has been a Shiva story. And I think about it that way. I think of myself. I tell the stories of myself as a Shiva girl. I was haughty and self-important, and I thought I knew everything. I still do sometimes. I thought I knew what was correct, what was right. I was a proud atheist who felt superior to those poor people who believed in an imaginary friend who could, help them whenever they wanted. One way to look at it is that Shiva came down with his great whirling dance of Katrina and turned my life completely upside down, along with the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And in that moment, the story that I told in the beginning of the podcast, in that moment, the days and weeks after Katrina, it became very clear to me that unless I chose to believe in something bigger than myself, bigger than my family, bigger than the government, I was never going to survive. That if I relied only on my human ingenuity, my human skills and abilities, that was not enough for what I was facing. I was profoundly unmatched. And in that moment of whatever we want to call it, surrender, grace, transformation, awakening, I made a conscious decision to believe. And my life has changed dramatically since then. And it has not always been easy. But this is one of the things that allows us to navigate unimaginable change in our lives. And I love these stories that come from spiritual traditions, religions, because they capture somehow this unmistakable truth of human experience in a prism, right? It's real and it's not real, right? A symbol stands for itself and for many other things. And this story of Shiva, every time I tell it, I understand it in a new way. Another layer is revealed to me. But this is what I know about change. Human brains, human egos are attached to things. We crave certainty. We want things to be predictable and expected. We desire like a clear, straightforward path. We follow the instructions and we get the results. We want life to be like a recipe in a book. If I cut things just the right way, if I cook things in the right order, then I will end up with the dish as promised. And that's not how life works in my experience. Sometimes, but it is not reliably true. What is reliably true is that in every moment, everything is changing. So whether those are subtle changes like the change in temperature, the shift in your breath, if you have ever felt any emotion, whether it's love or joy or fear or rage or anxiety, if you simply watch the sensation of the emotion as it happens inside you, you'll notice it changing constantly. The same thing is true in my experience of physical discomfort. If you have a physical sensation, pleasant or unpleasant, if you allow your attention to rest on that sensation, it does not stay the same. It moves, it changes. Maybe it throbs and then it stings, or where it is in the body begins to shift around. Everything is changing all the time. Nothing stays the same. And to me, that is the reminder that the Nataraj story gives us. It's the reminder that so many spiritual stories tell us that if we expect things to stay the same, we will be miserable. We will be stuck. We will be fighting against the tide. And when instead we allow ourselves to be transformed, And in my very core, this is what I believe the story of Jesus is about. The transformation, the unlikely resurrection of a human. That transcendence is the requirement and the promise of our spiritual practice. The Serenity prayer is an excellent anchor through all of this. So whether changes happen gradually over the course of years, like our bodies breaking down, aging, or instantly in a moment, like quitting a job or ending a relationship or a natural disaster or having a baby or, any dramatic shift you can imagine. The Serenity prayer is an anchor. It's a tremendous support. So that prayer, you probably have heard it, is grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And in my experience of this, the vast majority of the time, the things that I can change are remarkably smaller than the things I cannot change. And the things that I can change become profound. They become the greatest privilege of a lifetime, to change my own perspective, to examine my assumptions and my behavior, and to slowly make a shift in those, to find the things that I have found the most revolting about myself, that I have hidden and pushed down and hoped no one would ever see deep dark in that pine forest. And to begin to accept them initially, to welcome them, to allow them to be, and then often, in many circumstances, simply allowing and accepting something, it shifts and changes immediately. Maybe perceptibly, maybe not. I want to leave you with maybe one of the most profound things that has ever been said on this subject. And like most profound things, it's very, very few words. And it's from The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And in that book, she writes, God is change. God is change. And so if instead of resisting the shifts that are happening in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds, in our worlds, so much shifting, moving, changing all the time, the transitions are the reality. If we can learn to, at the very least, dance through that, to breathe and move with some sense of delight and joy and maybe even ecstasy. This is one of the invitations of a spiritual practice. And when I can do it, when any of us can do it, it makes every moment of being alive fascinating. It makes every moment of being alive extraordinary. And it releases our suffering, which I often think the most painful thing in most of our lives is the things that we are resisting as they change, the things we are holding on to keep them just as they were because, no, we really liked it this way. And it's changing anyway. And one of my favorite sayings is that, realizing that, after we finally are able to let go of whatever it is that we have left clamor, no, holding on so tight. That holding on so tight, it hurts. And so when we can learn to soften our grip, and at the very least to allow what is moving and changing to move and change, the full potential of life opens up. At the very least, We have a sense of ease. We can live every day with a sense of peace and steadiness that comes from inside of us rather than needing the things around us to stay the same or to be what we expect. And in time, as we allow those changes to move, we find a certain joy, a certain delight in that shift and change. I know that this is a really tall ask, and it's one of the reasons that I say that if it's the only episode that you listen to, if this is the only thing that you take away from any of my teaching, any of my work, I hope that this is it, which is that whether you like it or you don't like it, it will change. And what happens next is up to you. Can you learn to love the changes? Can you learn to be fascinated with how things are always shifting and moving? What do you need in order to let go of your gripping to how things are and instead get curious and even maybe excited about what could be? I'm so grateful to be on this path with you, curious hearts. If you have any questions about this, I would love to hear from you. If you hate this episode, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. You can send me a direct message. Otherwise, may you allow what needs to change today to change and see how that affects your experience of your aliveness. Thanks for tuning in, curious hearts. If this episode was useful, I hope you'll follow the show or leave a review or share it with somebody who you think needs it. And if you're craving support on your own spiritual path or seeking some meaningful work, you can find ways to work with me at veralester.com. Otherwise, until next time, please stay grounded in that curiosity that you've got and keep turning towards what matters. See y'all soon.